Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 317. I'm recording this on October 3rd, 2024, and this will go live on October 7th, 2024. So last week was a big week for me because on Sunday, the 29th of September, I turned 60. Yes, I somehow can't believe it. I definitely don't feel 60 in my body, which is good. And I am committed to keeping up with healthy habits so I can stay healthy in the years to come. It was definitely a big milestone, and it definitely gave me pause to think about not only what do I want to do in the next 3 months of this calendar year, 2024, but what do I want to do with the rest of my life? I somehow didn't have similar feelings when I turned 50. I'm definitely having all the feels now at 60. Am I really living in a way that's consistent with my vision? Am I really living in a way that I'm leveraging the skills that I have and the passion that I have for teaching yoga, for training teachers, for hosting this podcast, for creating lots of content, for working with entrepreneurs? I've actually, over the past several weeks, been reconnecting with a few contacts that I haven't really talked to since the pandemic and seeing if I can re-engage with those contacts. And they're not even necessarily people in the yoga industry. There are a lot of different areas that I love to go into. And it's not just around training yoga teachers. It's also around, honestly, teaching entrepreneurs how to start their own business, how to create content, how to track revenue, how to create brand messaging. There's quite a bit to the entrepreneurial journey that I've been through, and I love sharing it. If you haven't seen or you didn't know, I've written two books. One of them, Stretch, Build Your Yoga Business, Grow Your Teaching Techniques. The whole first section of that book was about how to build your business as a yoga teacher. And actually, a lot of those lessons in that book are transferable to anybody, regardless of what business they're in. So, over the past couple of weeks, matter of fact, last week, I did my first live presentation since before the pandemic. I did a presentation on how to create content for your podcast, and I did it at a place here in Boston called the Podcast Garage, which is a local recording studio where podcasters can come and use the space to record their show. And they can also use the space to come to seminars like the one I held, other free workshops that they have, and some are paid, all designed around helping people create content for their podcast and great audio and video that goes with it. So I'm excited about that, and just kind of getting into the vibe of being 60 and what that means to me, and where do I want to go in the next handful of years in my life. So I wanted to start with that, and maybe you were one of the ones that sent me a DM or wrote on my Facebook or Instagram happy birthday, or saw some of the stories I posted. I also had a couple of weeks ago a trip home to visit my parents, and we had a big birthday celebration. My dad and I actually share an almost birthday. He's the day before mine on September 28th. So I've had a couple of good weeks with just celebrations and family gatherings. And yeah, so super grateful for that. I wanted to sort of really dive into our conversation today because I want to be mindful of the time. I want to try to keep this episode to, kind of a under an hour time for you so that the commitment isn't huge. I know lately I've been listening to Rich Roll and Andrew Huberman, and those episodes are generally going well over 2 hours. And I don't want you to have to carve out 2 hours to get value out of this one. I want to start out by having a quick conversation with you about, and this is going to kind of sound like it's coming out of left field, what it is that you value when it comes to teaching yoga. And I was thinking of this when I was actually listening to Dr. Huberman's show the other day, and he was speaking to a neuroscientist, I believe, at Stanford, who focuses on memory. And so, even though the topic of memory and the topic of values don't sound like they're a match, in that conversation, the person he was interviewing was talking about values and living in a way that's consistent with your values, which generally, I'm sure you can appreciate when you live in a way that's consistent with your values, you tend to be happier because you're doing things that reflect things that are important to you. I was thinking as I was listening to him, this is a really interesting framework to think about teaching yoga because many times when we're teaching our classes, we might be out of sync with what we value. Let's say, for instance, you really value making an impact on your students where you can see them, where you can give them cues that meet the moment of what they're experiencing. That's something that you value about your abilities and the value you can add to a student when they come to your class. But when you go in to teach, you practice with your students. And so what that means is you're not actually teaching in a way consistent with what you value, at least in this regard. Let's say another thing is you really value making connections with your students. But you find in reality, when you go to the studio, you really get caught up in the nervousness, in the feeling that people are judging you, in the feeling that you're not an expert. And so as a result, you might kind of hold back from engaging students in conversation. You might beat yourself up when you're driving home from teaching class and think, oh, why didn't I do a better job? So that's another example where you might not be teaching in a way consistent with what you value. So I want you to think about what are the things that you value about teaching yoga? And it's a little bit of an adjacent conversation because it's not for you to answer in terms of what you value about yoga to you as a practitioner. It's more from the perspective of when you're teaching, what are the qualities that you aspire to have? So it's a little bit of that. And what do you value? Like, what are these qualities that you value about the kind of teacher you desire to be? And now, once you list those out, it's a matter of being honest with yourself about when I go into the studio, am I actually demonstrating those qualities of teaching that I value? I'll give you another example. Let's say you really value the quality of being able to walk around the room and not have to look at your notes and be really present for your students. Let's say that that's important to you, that you aspire to do that. And you find that when you go in to teach your class, you're constantly looking at your notes and you're really focused on having your notes there as a visual anchor and as an emotional anchor as well, because you're worried that if you leave the notes at home, you're going to have mind going blank syndrome. You're going to have that experience of your mind going blank. So that's another example of you're not teaching in a way consistent with what you value. And so this is just an opportunity for you to really be honest with yourself about what do I need to do differently so that I can be teaching in a way consistent with what I value. Do I need new skills? Do I need new training? Do I need, new expertise? Do I need some belief busting work to bust through some of the self-limiting beliefs that I have about my abilities, right? So there's always going to be an answer that comes to you for each one of these things. The place to start, though, is to start with an honest assessment of, are you teaching in a way consistent with what you value? So I wanted to start out with that. Now, the next thing that I wanted to share with you is a couple of pieces that I'm pulling from a book that I'm reading. And for those of you watching on YouTube, I'll show you the book. It's called The Yoga Body, The Origins of Modern Posture Practice by Mark Singleton. And I was inspired to pick up this book because over the past month, I've participated in 2 different training programs, both focused on yoga philosophy, and both speakers reference this book. So I thought, let me get this book. It's been a while since I've really taken some time to revive my knowledge of the history of yoga and yoga philosophy as a framework through which you can view the world and obviously be a yoga teacher. And so I thought, oh, this would be a good opportunity for me to pick up a new book and dive into it. And I wanted to share with you some of the interesting things that came up in this book. So this is not everything about this book. It's just, I'm sort of halfway through it, and I wanted to just share with you a couple of things that I found sort of revelatory. The first part of the book, he goes into this whole sort of description of how yoga was initially viewed in the world. And he goes back like in time to like the 1800s. And he talks about, the poses were initially viewed as something that was actually wrong. He says, at the time in the 1890s, postural practice was primarily associated with the yogin, which is what they called yogis back then. This term designated in particular the hatha yogis of a particular lineage, but was employed more loosely to refer to groups of people who were seen as magicians and street performers. So I thought that was kind of interesting. He then, another couple of things that I wanted to share with you that I thought was interesting. He talked about Krishnamacharya, who you've probably heard of Krishnamacharya. He lived 1888 through 1989, and he was the founder of Mysore as a yogic style of practice. And he says here, it is well known that the work of Bombay-based gurus, Sri Yogendra and Krishnamacharya, and his now famous Mysore disciples, were instrumental in bringing hatha yogic asanas, which are the poses, into the public eye. It was largely due to their efforts and those of their disciples indeed that postural practice is now so prominent in transnational yoga circles. And so in the beginning part of this book, what he's peeling back the layers on is this idea that yoga as we know it, certainly in the United States, and as it looks today, is quite different from how it looked when it started. And all of the influences that initially were influencing the beginning of yoga even being introduced here in the West. Let me see what else I wanted to share with you. I know this is kind of bouncing all over the place, but I want to just kind of pull up a couple of other references and just see. Let's see. Okay, so he says, a more valid and helpful way of thinking beyond such unproductive positions might be to consider the term yoga as it refers to modern postural practice as a homonym. So it's not the same thing as yoga, it's related to yoga. And not a synonym of the yoga associated with the philosophical system of Patanjali. And I'm sure you know Patanjali is the author of the Yoga Sutras. And he says, or even the Bhagavad Gita. In other words, although the word yoga, as it's used popularly today, is identical in spelling and pronunciation in each of the instances of the Bhagavad Gita and the Gita and the Sutras, it has quite different meanings and origins. It is, in short, a homonym, and it should therefore not be assumed that it refers to the same body of beliefs and practices as these other terms. If this is admitted as the basis for further discussion, we are free to consider postural modern yoga on its own terms instead of in negative comparison to other traditions called yoga. So I find, this kind of discussion kind of interesting because I know sometimes in different conversations with yoga teachers and different posts on social media, there'll be things that come up that question whether or not the yoga that's being practiced in the United States in particular is actually yoga and should be called yoga. But even here in this book, he goes into a discussion about, even if we just look at the 8 limbs, asana is one of those limbs. So it literally is one of the limbs. It's just that he goes on to say the emphasis on that limb in particular is seemingly the way yoga is presented here in the West, much more than in other parts of the world. Let me just see if there's anything else. And as I go through this over the next couple of weeks, I'll be sharing more of what I learn with you. So just give me a second here as I look through and just see. He goes on to describe a whole bunch of early textbooks that contain references to yoga. He talks about yoga and how initially the poses, really were super complicated, and he has pictures of early practitioners and the high degree of flexibility they had, and how they were practicing, which honestly looks somewhat different to how we practice today. He actually mentioned as well a book called let me see, Siva Samhita, and he talks about, it actually references the anatomy, and he says the book has better anatomy is given than in the medical works of the Hindus in this book. It gives a description of neurons, ganglia, and the solar plexus and other plexes of the nervous system, and is proof that the Hindus were acquainted with the spinal cord, brain, and central nervous system. So I would definitely say, and I know that this is just a real cursory review, but I would definitely say this book is definitely worth getting. I'll just give you the reference again: Yoga Body, The Origins of Modern Posture Practice. And again, as I go through the book further, I'll hop on here and I'll give you a couple of just snippets from it, so you can, make a decision if it's something that you want to take a deeper dive into. It's a little bit heavy. I find the text and the writing to be it just requires a lot of concentration. So I basically go to Starbucks and sit for 45 minutes and do that in chunks over a period of a few weeks. I've been doing it now. The other thing I would mention, and I'll just say this as we close, I recently did a workshop on how to easily bring yoga philosophy into your classes. And I have gotten a couple of requests for this topic. I'm actually going to be adding a chapter on it to my program. So if you're listening and you're already enrolled in the Yoga Anatomy Blueprint Learning Program, I'll be adding a special section on this topic because, I want you to keep in mind, even though on basically all of the episodes where I'm doing solo teaching of anatomy and cueing and sequencing, I don't really get into the philosophy. It is something that, number one, if you're called to speak on, number two, if it's an area you want to, dive into, it's definitely something that, is certainly worth adding into your classes. And having said that, I think where yoga teachers often get tripped up is they're not exactly sure how to share it in the classes. And so the workshop that I did really covers that. And I've done a couple of Instagram lives where I've given little snippets from that workshop. So I'll just leave it with you that if you would like to know more about my step-by-step easy way to share yoga philosophy in your classes, just send me a DM on Instagram, and I'm happy to just send you just a quick text with a couple of highlights of the workshop I did. And then I can also send you the link to the Instagram live, and you can watch that for kind of the full story on how to do it. So that's it for today. I wanted to leave you with one other call to action step you can take. If you haven't yet downloaded my free ebook called The Bare Bones Yoga Guide to Incredible Teaching, I highly recommend, if you're actively teaching weekly classes, you get it. I wrote it this summer. Here we are in October. I just wrote it in July. I actually even revised it shortly thereafter to, kind of add a couple of additional pieces. It's an amazing compilation of all of my best teaching methodologies around cueing and sequencing, as well as mindset habits and ways to move past limiting beliefs so you can really go into your classes and feel confident. It's really something I could charge for, but I wanted to make it super accessible. So to get that ebook, all you need to do is go to the link in my Instagram bio, and you can do that right now because I'm pretty sure you're probably listening on your phone. And when you go to the link in my Instagram bio and click it, you're going to see the ebook is right there for you to download. And then the last thing I wanted to offer you is, over the past couple of weeks, I've had a couple of just one-off phone calls with yoga teachers who are having a particular problem. They're not exactly sure how to solve it. Mostly has been around things around cueing, sequencing, and understanding anatomy. These are always the main areas that seem to come up all the time. And so I've done what I tend to call a solution session. And this is just a free call where you and I get together on Zoom and you tell me what the problem is. I'm not really sure how to share anatomy in my cues, or I'm spending hours every week prepping my sequences, and I still feel like every time I go into the room, I need to practice with my students and I really want to walk around the room. Or I'm not really sure how to build a sequence with a peak pose, or I don't know how to share anatomy in my cues, right? So whatever the problem is, we can just do a quick solution session, and I can give you some tips to get you started so you're moving in the right direction and you're starting to build momentum. And there's nothing better. That's why I call it the magic of momentum. There's nothing better than starting to build momentum, because that's how you really start to feel like you're moving in the direction of your dreams. So if you'd like to set up a solution session with me, just send me a DM on Instagram with the words solution session and we'll set it up. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I will talk to you and see you if you're watching on YouTube on the next episode of Conversations for Yoga Teachers. Until then, keep up the amazing work and talk to you soon. Namaste.